Evolution, Revolution, a discussion on the changing shape of us. This podcast series has grown out of some articles I've written, which you can find in the show notes. LifeLine Church is undergoing a transition. This is a critical stage for those who have grown up in LifeLine or joined along the journey to bring their unique contribution to the table, because those that have led for the last 40 years won't be leading for the next 40. As we continue the journey, we need to know what we need to carry with us, what can be left behind, and what needs to be developed. I hope this podcast, along with my articles, might provoke and inspire you to offer what you carry.
Okay, excellent. So you are here with myself, Nick. I've got Ella. Ella, do you want to say hello?
Hey.
And we've got Jamie.
Hello.
Hello, Jamie. Okay, cool. So what we're hoping to do with this podcast and further podcasts is kind of have a little think about some stuff you've been writing, what is in that, and how as a church that can mean something for us, and what that does mean for us. So could you just maybe give us a brief overview of what you've been writing and what's caused you, like, just what caused you to start writing things down? I know that's quite a big question.
Okay. Yeah. So there have been a number of topics that I've been thinking about, I've done teaching on, I've been chatting around with people for a while, and I thought it would be quite handy to kind of pull all those threads together in one place. And so I originally thought I'd write a blog, and then as I started writing it, I thought, no, this isn't one blog, this is many blogs, and I thought, no, this isn't really a blog, it's more of an article. So that was the kind of the genesis of it, but I think the purpose of it is as a point of the journey where we're up to as LifeLine Church, where we're crossing into unfamiliar territory. And when I think of the story of the Israelites, Deuteronomy is called the second law, and it was a point where Moses laid out again the same things that had been laid out to their parents, who was the first ones to have left Egypt. And it was repeated, but not completely verbatim. There were certain adaptations and variations. But I feel for us right now, we're about to enter into the land, continue on the pilgrimage that we've been on. And there's an opportunity for us to hear afresh the things that have been said to, effectively, to our parents' generation. And so it's a calling for how do we enter the land, both those that are veterans, so have been around for a while, and for those that are emerging, that we are called to journey together. So there's different things that each of us carry that is going to be valuable. And so I'm hoping that these articles could help kind of set the parameters to how we journey together, what is our common understanding.
Okay, wicked. So just the way in which these podcasts are going to work, I'm going to lead with some questions. We've also got Ella here, who will be definitely chipping in with some thoughts and questions. We may ask questions that seem like they've got pretty obvious answers, but I just want to try and make sure that this is accessible for all. I've had a lot of conversations with you, and I'm aware that there's a lot of context that I would understand, and Ella to an extent also. But so bear with us as we ask a lot of questions. And as I've been reading the articles, it felt like before we really got stuck into what those articles are talking about, maybe to think about a concept that you talk about quite early on, which is the concept of deconstruction and reconstruction. And as I was reading the first article, which was called...
It all starts with a glimpse.
It all starts with a glimpse.
Mm-hmm.
There was something that you said in that article that I thought that we could where we could start. So you said, under the leadership of John Singleton, a large emphasis has been put on being doers and not just hearers of the word. So my first question would be, how has that emphasis come about?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's in the scripture. So James 1:22 says, "Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourself, do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word and does not do what it says is like someone that looks at his face in the mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. And so there is a requirement that we enact the things that God shows to us and says to us. And I think particularly from my dad's perspective over the years of growing up in different churches, he's seen how much airtime you can give to talking about what God wants that doesn't filter through into action. One of the things would be, we talk about in his church when he was growing up, we all talk about or share the blessing with each other. And so you spend the most of the meeting just staring at the back of someone's head. Then they turn around at the end and you say, "Bless you, brother, see you next week." But there's nothing of expressing what the Bible talks about, of living life together, knowing what's going on for each other, caring and loving. But yet we can all talk about what we've heard, just not enact it. And so there's always been an emphasis of the Word of God is given for us to live it out. So that's kind of where it's come from.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. But as I was kind of reading and even just listening to you speak just then, I'm wondering, is there a temptation to be doers without ever being hearers? Because while I totally understand that the frustration that would come from just talking about something and never living it out, there is something potentially, you could maybe skip a step and just think, right, I'm going to do a load of practical things without ever necessarily grasping the hearer's part of that.
Definitely. And in some cases, that's more of a temptation for us as a church that has put such an emphasis on being doers. And what you can end up finding yourself in is within a culture of this is what we do because we are part of this particular body and that's how it works here, without knowing the reasons behind it. And that certainly is a danger. I think the last podcast I shared the story about the mother that put the turkey in the oven and cut the legs off before putting it in. She was doing without really knowing why she was doing it. Only when she spoke to her mother, she said, "Well, the reason why I cut the legs off was because it couldn't fit in my oven. Why are you cutting your legs off?" And I think there is always a temptation just to do because it's easy, because it doesn't involve thinking. But I think we should be thinkers.
Yeah. For me, anyways, from conversations I've had with John, like part of his revelation comes from going to different churches and experiencing them, and then having this revelation that maybe he's received a revelation from God about the right way that we should do church. Do you feel like maybe people that have been in the church for a long time, or people that have grown up in the church, maybe that could be a block because they haven't experienced other church communities or even necessarily visited many other churches?
So let me get you straight, Ellen. Because someone's not got a wider experience of churches, they would find it difficult to know different ways of expressing a value, or
just like they might not really understand why there's such importance on certain values.
Right.
Yeah, like maybe they just wouldn't get it because they just see that every day, or like...
So like John's kind of seeing all this stuff and then really fought for what he believes to be valuable, and then part of being in this church, living in the benefit of that means that there hasn't necessarily had to been a grappling for themselves.
Yeah,
kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that could always be a danger. And I think that's why it's so important that we know why we do what we do, so that we can share that or live from that, rather than just follow the crowd or the culture. And it's amazing how quickly people acclimatise to a culture without knowing quite what's going on. I remember one of the young people once bringing their exchange student that was staying with them to the meeting, and they had their hands up in the time of worship because they're looking around that, everyone else has got their hands up, that's what you've got to do here. There's no problem with doing that, but also there's no problem not doing that. And so our focus has always got to be, we want people to have their own conviction, get their own sight of who God is. And so we can never be satisfied with just someone mapping the same behaviour. We want to lead them through to a revelation.
Cool. Well, that brings me on quite nicely to my next question. So at LifeLine Church, we talk a lot about values and expressions. Could you give us an example of a value that LifeLine Church holds dear, and what the scriptural basis and maybe just the historical basis is for that value?
Sure. And so when we're talking about values, we're talking about effectively the nature and personality of God, an attribute of God. And so one could be the value of people belonging, really being part of a family. And so if it's an aspect of the nature of God, it will be confirmed within Scripture. And so you would get things like in John 1:12, yet all those who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave right to become children of God. So that was about belonging into God's family. That's what Jesus came to do. So when I look at Jesus, I see belonging. I see an invitation. He talks about, so Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 6:18, I will be a father to you, and you will be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. So that is in the very nature of God, to help people belong, be part of it. Galatians, Paul talks about there's neither Jew nor Greek, that those barriers are broken down because people are being joined together. Romans 11 talks about being grafted in. And so all those aspects of the nature of God to belong would be a value that John has seen, and it's something that we promote, we want to see happen. So that would be the value aspect.
And just, that's really clear, but just thinking about that value of belonging, how have you seen or even personally experienced that value being expressed?
Well, I was thinking about that belonging aspect. Inclusion would be a big part of that, and I always used to like just having my small friendship groups. And I remember one New Year's Eve party, I'd wanted us to do something as a youth group, but no one else wanted to do it. So I thought, right, fine, I'll just do something for me and just a handful of friends. Then suddenly all these kids that said no, they didn't want to do anything, started wanting to piggyback on what I was doing. And I remember feeling this kind of twisting in my gut, like, no, this is just for me and my close friends. And I remember my dad saying to me, is there any way that you could include these other people? And I remember saying, no, I can't fit them in my car. And
how old were you, roughly, do you think?
Well, I was 15, so I'd roped in a youth leader to be my driver.
Right.
So it was me and the youth leader and 3 other friends. And I remember it didn't sit right with me, but I didn't want to change. And something happened in me over the next year, because by the time the next New Year's Eve party came round, what I organised was something that was local, that was accessible, that anyone could come to. And so, similar to Ella's question, even though that it was a value that John had, that he promoted within the church, I still had to have my own revelation of it. And there was something that changed in me. Well, I experienced the inclusion of God that caused me to then want to be an includer of others. And that meant sacrificing my little group. And in fact, I had a much better time because I didn't have that kind of grind inside me to try and protect my space. So that was an inclusion and belonging that came out of my revelation. But other things that I've seen, when we went into lockdown for COVID, we quickly moved our meetings to Zoom, and it was very complicated trying to learn Zoom and kind of progress 250 people onto the internet. But one of the guys, Matt, had said, do you know Zoom actually has a translation function? So we can actually be translating what we're saying, or have a channel where someone translates for people that don't speak English, and we've got a few of those people amongst us. And there was others in the team that are saying, come on, it's far too complicated. Let's not try and make things too complicated. And Matt was dogged. He said, but would that not be in God's heart to make something inclusive? And I thought, absolutely it would be. And Matt had seen something that he was pursuing. And then I think even if you look at some of the things we're doing through the hub, connecting with local people, there's always about belonging, and that's probably the clearest thing that comes out of local people that we've met is, I feel like this is my family. When family members come to visit, they bring them to the hub to introduce them to their local family. And I think a big aspect of belonging is knowing that you can contribute. And so that's always been a priority within the hub, is if you come to benefit, you also come to give, because that's the way that we feel that we belong. And I think that's all expressions of that value.
So I want to now think about a little bit of what do we mean when we're talking about deconstruction and reconstruction in a church context. So yeah, when we're talking about deconstruction, reconstruction, what is it that you mean?
So what I mean with deconstruction is about unpacking the expression. So we might have a way of doing things, but expressions need to be constantly updated to make sure that they're relevant and expressing the value. So if we talk about in the Church of England, you'll have pews, which were very relevant at one stage, because that's how they used to run the hot water pipes across the church to heat the church. So having it in nice running under the pews seemed very relevant. Once you move to central heating, there's no need to sit people on those uncomfortable pews anymore. And so what we've fallen into in that case is keeping a tradition going that's no longer expressing comfort, inclusion, love, and things like that. And so we've always got to be ready to say, okay, that's what we did yesterday. What's relevant for today? But we want to be faithful to the values, and the expressions have to become relevant for that. So there'll be things that we need to look back over and say, okay, now with the advance of the internet, is this still important that we do things this way? What is the most meaningful way of doing it? So strip things back, get right back to the why behind why we do what we do. And then to reconstruct is thinking, okay, what's a better way of expressing those things?
Cool.
Is there only expressions that we would deconstruct?
What, like, would we deconstruct a value?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really know.
Well, because maybe... So we've been talking, like, the example of a value we've been talking about is belonging. Which, I think you gave a really clear kind of explanation of where that comes from biblically, what that looks like, what it has looked like, what it looks like now. We have certain emphasis on values, and not to say that there'd be biblical values that we ignore, but I think it'd be fair to say that we emphasise different values. So are you maybe saying, would it be, I'm talking to you, Ella, would it be thinking about, are there different values to emphasise, or...
I don't know if the question makes sense. I'm just wondering, does it only apply to expressions, deconstruction? Doesn't apply to anything else? I suppose that is an expression, isn't it?
What are you going to say?
we only do church on Sunday, like, or something like that, like, or like, we have to
do prayer meeting every Tuesday.
Yeah, like
Tuesday
this is. Do you know what I mean? Like those, or is it? Yeah.
I mean, I would put those things down
Under
as expressions.
Yeah.
I don't. I mean, God is the same today and forever, so I don't expect His values to change. Our revelation of His value, I would hope, would continue to grow and to be understood. So there'd be a change in terms of that, but I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where we're thinking, I don't think God is really into belonging anymore. I don't think that would change. And one of the things that I do think about sometimes the values are held in tension. So belonging, if I'm talking about everyone bringing a contribution, but then if we're also talking about excellence being another value, how do you let other people contribute by doing something if the standard of it will end up dropping from excellent? What is the priority, and how do you hold those things in tension? So there's all things like that where you're kind of wrestling through to figure out how does that work.
Yeah, because a question that I wanted to follow up with was, and we kind of started to think about that already, but what could be some of the challenges in a process of deconstruction and reconstruction in a church? And I'm just thinking about the fact that maybe young people, for example, or younger people, are growing up in an environment where belonging, for example, could almost be entirely digital, you know. I don't know, thinking out loud, there are gaming communities of people who have never met. There's studies that suggest, you know, that can improve young people's mental health and a sense of, you know, belonging in that sense. But that would feel very different to what I understand as belonging, inclusion. I'd feel like people being together would be a big part of that. So, and you just kind of spoke about holding things in tension. So, like, how do we combat some of those challenges when you've got generational differences, just technological? Is that question clear?
I mean, I guess going back to the question you asked right at the start, what we're seeking to do with these podcasts and articles, it's really setting the parameters where we can have these kind of conversations, because we want to journey together. We want the veterans, we want the young people emerging to be really wrestling this stuff out and have the permission to say, okay, well, how does it look now? We would talk about stewardship being a value and using your money in wise ways. But then you're looking at the housing market now, like, what is the chances of getting on the housing market? So then, well, renting, is that good stewardship, or having to leave the area to find a house where we've always looked at being geographically close, and can I now be virtually part of the community in the same way? I think that it's all part of the discussion, but the core thing that I want to set out is we got to start with, what do we see when we look at Him? What does God want? And then we work from that, rather than this is what I fancy, or this seems more pragmatic or convenient. It's got to be on what pleases God. And if that's my focus, then I want to find the best way to represent. And it's not necessarily going to be the easiest way. So, yeah, I think those are part of it. I think in terms of the broader question of what are the kind of other challenges, when you are deconstructing something that someone else has fought to put together,
in this case you're referring to John, your dad, like
yeah, they have scars fighting for the things that we have now, that we can end up taking for granted or even neglecting. That even Paul in 1 Corinthians 3, he says, by the grace of God, By the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as a wise builder, and someone else is building on it, but each one should build with care. That I want to treasure the same thing that my dad did when he started building what we have now. And that's a heart set on pilgrimage. That's a focus on, I want to please God. I want to be part of his building of his church and his kingdom. And therefore, I treat it with care, what I'm unpacking. It doesn't mean that we don't do it, but we don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. We have to get behind, what was the reason behind why we did this? Is it still relevant? What is a more faithful and relevant expression of that value today? It can never be, I just don't really like that value, so we just discard the value. That would not be being faithful to the revelation that God's given us. And also, like the example I gave, I needed to have my own revelation of something that I already bought into in theory. And the danger was I was a hearer and not a doer of that thing. It had to become real to me. And so when we realise, I don't actually cherish this value that we all talk about here. God, come do something in me. Cause me to see this value in you that becomes my motivation and my transformation, so that I will lay down my life to see you expressed, this value of you expressed in my life.
Cool. So, very aware that we've been speaking a lot about John Singleton, who is your dad, and you've had naturally quite close proximity to your dad. How would people who maybe haven't had that close proximity connect, take it on board, realise that they are part of something that God has been doing for decades now, and they're not, and because they're not just trying to recreate what's happened, but also being able to hold the importance of what has been forged out and also go forward? I'm just wondering, how would someone maybe who's come along to Sunday mornings and maybe chatted with your dad but doesn't know him, doesn't know his story and what's happened, how is this relevant for them?
It's always tricky when there's been such a clear leader figure that it's not something that my dad has sought to cultivate, but just the way that we work as humans, we can kind of develop a cult of personality and have so much pinned on to a person. But my dad is just a human like the rest of us. And he does his best with all of the challenges and the weaknesses that he faces like the rest of us. And so he wouldn't want the focus to be on him, but he has a responsibility and a privilege to share the revelation that he's got. And within the role of being the father of the house, he has to give account to God for how has he pursued and led others into the revelation and being faithful with what they've experienced. But I think for those that haven't had that closeness of proximity, God is still the same God. And they still have the same need to have a revelation of the very values that we talk about in the same way that someone that's been close to Dad. I've heard of stories of people using the John Singleton trump card. Well, John Singleton wouldn't see it that way. But you've got young people saying, well, who's John Singleton? Yeah. They know him in name, they know what he looks like, but he's not had the investment in their lives directly because he can't with everyone. There's too many people. But what we have to do in those situations is, if we know the reasons why, if we know the values, if we've had our revelation, we can share that, we can lead others into that. And particularly for those that have grown up within the church, the danger is you think you know it, because in theory you know it academically, but do you love it? Do these values excite you, float your boat? Are you willing to lay down your life for them? And almost keep giving the young person that opportunity to say, I don't really see it, I don't experience it. And it's like, that's absolutely fine, but God's at your door. He wants you to see him, that each will know him from the least to the greatest. And so rather than just getting people to keep the same expression going, I want people to see the same God. And so it can't be dependent on any one person. It's dependent on the revelation that God has.
Amazing. Do you have any questions, Ella, just before we close? That's kind of from my end.
Yeah, for like young people that like know they know what it is that they know what LifeLine stands on, they know what the values are, but they don't love it. Like, what is there for them?
I think the key thing is, rather than love LifeLine, not love LifeLine, do I love God? And there's a John Piper quote that says, if all I have for Christ is a decision for Christ and not a delight for Christ, then I don't know Christ. And that's the thing that I would want to put the focus on, because we can nitpick from now to eternity on what we as a church and we as leaders do well or don't do well, but I want my life to be about living in partnership with the Spirit of God that wants to reveal his nature to a world that is desperate for him. I want to be part of that. But if all I do is play church, do meetings and do activities, but I don't have the sense of the love of God for this world coming out of me, then it's miserable. I don't want anyone to live that miserable life. I want people to know him for themselves. So that would be my focus. And sometimes that's pretty scary, particularly for a young person to admit, saying, you know what, I don't even really like God. I don't feel that I know God. I definitely wouldn't be willing to sacrifice my street cred or respectability amongst my peers to promote him in any way. Well, if you could admit that, that's the first step to saying, God, I need you in a way that I don't think I've ever known you. And there's always got to be the space for people to say that. We can't just assume because you've grown up in the church that any of this stuff has actually been buried inside you and growing up inside of you.
Cool. Well, I think that is going to set us up quite nicely as we go on to explore some more of what you got in your articles. So we will leave it there for now. Thank you very much, Jamie, and thank you, Ella. Thanks for listening to this 8-episode podcast exploring how to make a healthy transition to the next generation as a church whose heart is set on pilgrimage. We invite you to listen to the full series, but also to get in touch if you have questions so that iron can sharpen iron as we bring our collective wisdom together. Our contact details can be found in the show notes. For further teaching, do tap into the LifeLine Church Sunday Teaching Podcast and watch out for our conversational podcast on questions arising from the Book of Kings, due to be released in July 2023.